Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on immigration visa options for IMGs. My name is Naveen Bhora. I am the managing attorney of our firm's New York office, and I'm really happy to have you all join us today. What we're going to do is talk about the different non-immigrant visa options for physicians who are starting their residency or research career in the U.S. and then how one transitions from that to perhaps getting a waiver. We'll also talk about how one goes about obtaining the actual non-immigrant visa status and some common issues or problems. Then at the very end, I will take some questions. Okay, to get started, the most common visa options for physicians are the J1 and the H1. We will focus on these two visas today, but I also wanted to mention the O1 visa, which is for scientists or artists or athletes of extraordinary ability. The TN is limited to Canadians and Mexicans based on the Treaty NAFTA, and for physicians, the TN is limited to teaching and research, so not for clinical. The E3 is also based on a treaty, but with the United States and Australia, and so this visa is limited to Australian citizens only. It is comparable to an H1B, but again, it's limited to Australians. Okay, so moving on, the J1 visa is the most common work visa, visa issued for residency or GME. It is triggered once you've got, you found out you've matched in 2 weeks, and ECF&G issues the DS 2019 form to you. This will be done once you submit to ECF&G the USMLEs, the statement of need, and the contract with the hospital or the program. Then ECF&G issues a document called the DS 2019 form. It is a State Department form, and then with this you can actually then proceed to obtain your J1 visa. You don't actually need to have a petition granted by immigration unless you're requesting USCIS to change your status within the United States from some other non-immigrant visa, such as a tourist visa or a student visa, to the J1. The spouses of J1 visa holders obtain a J2 visa. One of the benefits of the J2 is that there is this ability to obtain an EAD, which is an employment authorization document. It is a work card, and it's great because then the spouse is sort of free to do whatever he or she may like to do. We often see spouses are both physicians, so one principal J1 is doing his or her residency on the J1, and then the spouse matches and starts the residency program on the J2 EAD. Just to keep in mind that sometimes timing can be a little bit tricky, so if the principal J1's training is going to be completed before the J2 completes his or her residency or fellowship, then there may be a gap or a break in employment authorization when the principal J1 then transitions to an H1, for example, as part of a waiver obligation. Then it might be difficult for the spouse who's been doing their training or their residency on the J2 EAD to continue, and that person may then actually be forced to get his or her own J1. The other issues that are specific to the J1 is this concept of the 2-year home residence requirement. We will go into that in a little bit more detail, but another issue is the 214B issue. This is specifically when somebody is applying for a visa at a U.S. consulate abroad. For J1s, that means that they have to show they have strong ties to their home country, and that when they finish the training, that they're going to go back home. So when you are applying for a J1 visa, make sure you have a lot of documents with you when you're going to the embassy showing your ties to your home country, that you have bank accounts and property and family, a potential job lined up, so that the consulate officer feels comfortable that you will be going back home upon completing the training and that you have no desire to live in the United States on a permanent basis. Another issue is that the J1 is actually limited to 7 years of progressive training. It is possible to get an 8th or 9th year on the J1. This becomes significant for people who have longer training, tracks such as surgery. If you're going to go through surgery and then you plan on getting a fellowship in cardiothoracic or something like that, you would have to, you're going to reach your 7 year, and then you'll have to get an 8th or 9th year extension. And for that, you do need a letter from home country showing that there's an exceptional need for that specialty. Another very common issue, I actually see this a lot within the folks who go into surgery, is that they often get matched into a preliminary position or slot, so that's only for 1 year. And then going on to the PGY2 year, instead of getting another prelim, PGY2 position or a categorical position, they have to go backwards. And then ECFMG will not support the next J1 for the following matched program unless they can see that this is moving forward in your training, that you are progressing. So that can be an issue for some people, and they get stuck because they've already done 2 years on residency, and then they can't necessarily go backwards and start again from the beginning. Another issue with the J1s is timing. If you're planning to stay in the United States and change status from whatever visa you may hold to the J1 after you receive the DS 2019, just keep in mind that the application is the I-539 application. With immigration, there is no request for premium processing, so it is a standard process that can take about 2 months. In terms of timing, that means, assuming you match on March 20th and you're getting all the paperwork together, by the time you receive the DS 2019 from ECFMG, it may be mid to end of April. So you really don't have too many weeks to get the change of status granted by immigration, and it may be faster to just go home, get the visa, and then come back. But we will talk about this in a little bit more detail later on in the afternoon. The J1 is also a common visa for research, and many folks who want to get into the more competitive residency field may want to first consider doing some research before applying. So you can get a J1 for research. These J1s are sponsored by the universities, so the universities have their own J1 programs, and then the university would be the one DS 2019 form. The other thing to keep in mind is that you can become subject to the 2-year home residence requirement based on research as well. If your country appears on the State Department's list, it's also possible that if you get any form of government funding, either from your home government or the U.S. government, such as a Fulbright, that would also make you subject to the 2-year home residence requirement. It is possible to transition from J1 research to J1 clinical, but you do need to explain to ECFMG the nexus between the research that was being done and your clinical training. You can also go from H1B research to J1, and that's fine. All right, so what is the 2-year home residence requirement, and how do you know if you're subject, and then what do you do if you're subject? The law mandates that anyone who is subject has to go home for 2 years before you can get an H visa, an L visa, which is for intercompany transfers, or a green card. And you are not eligible to change status within the United States. So if you're on a J1 and then you wanted to change to the J2 because your spouse is now on J1, you can't actually ask immigration to change your status within the United States. You would have to depart, go to the U.S. consulate abroad, get a new visa, and then come back in. That does also mean that you are able to get all these other visa types, such as the O1 for a person of extraordinary ability, or if you're Canadian, the Treaty NAFTA. But again, you will need to depart the U.S., get your visa from a U.S. consulate, and come back in order to activate that status. You will become subject if you're going to do any form of GME training in the United States. And then you will also become subject if you get any form of government sponsorship or scholarship, such as a Fulbright. And then again, if you are if you're from a country that appears on the U.S. State Department skills list. J2 visa holders also automatically become subject just by virtue of the fact that they have a derivative visa to the J1. What do you do if you are subject? You can, of course, go back home for 2 years. Just keep in mind that this has to be the country that's designated as your country of residence when you first obtain your DS 2019. You can do this in increments as well. Or you can get, if you would like not to do it in one go, you can get another visa, such as an O1, and then fulfill this requirement in increments over a few years. You can also obtain a waiver of the 2-year home residence requirement. Another issue to keep in mind that if you do obtain residency or citizenship in a third country, such as Canada or the UK, you can't fulfill your 2-year residence requirement in that country. You have to go back to the original country. We actually see this quite often with people who go back to the Middle East, for example, instead of their home country. Just being abroad does not fulfill this requirement. You do need to go back home to your actual country that's designated on the DS 2019. And you can do this in increments over several years. Okay, I think we've covered this already. Okay, now you can fulfill it by going home. You can do it in increments, or you can get a waiver. The most common waiver application is the Conrad State 30 waiver. This is something that you have to keep in, sort of start thinking about when you're coming to the end of your training and what type of waiver you hope to obtain. The Conrad 30 waiver is an interested government agency waiver. It is done by every state, has like a Department of Health that supports the waiver application, and every state has 30 slots that they can recommend. The more popular states, use up their slots pretty quickly. Some states that may not be as attractive, they tend to have waivers available throughout the year. The application process begins at the beginning of the fiscal year, which is typically October 1. And for the more popular states, everyone tries to file that application by October 1, and then you find out by December or January if the state is going to support the application and forward it on to the State Department with their recommendations. The Conrad 30 is also specifically geared towards people who go into primary care practice or pediatrics or OBGYN psychiatry. Most states also have a few slots set aside for specialists as well, but the overall goal is to try and fill these slots with people who are in primary care. They also try to have these slots filled by facilities located in underserved areas. It's called a HPSA, a Healthcare Professional Shortage Area, or a medically underserved area. These don't always have to be in rural neighborhoods. There are pockets even in Manhattan that are considered HPSAs. So when you're looking at or considering Conrad waiver jobs, once you have an address of a particular hospital that you're considering, we can look that address up to see if it falls within a HPSA location. And if you love the job and the facility is not in a HPSA location, it's still possible to apply for a waiver based on this concept of a flex slot that there's still patient populations coming to the facility who actually reside in HPSA locations. The Veterans Administration is another government agency that supports waiver applications, and this one is not, specifically geared towards primary care physicians, so it may be a good option for people who specialize. The Appalachian Regional Commission also supports the waiver applications. and these are mostly for states, and well, specifically for states that fall in that particular region, such as parts of Ohio, New York, and Maryland. So there are specific states, and if you do fall in that Appalachian region, then it's better, to perhaps do your application through the ARC instead of through that state's Department of Health, so that you're not taking up one of the 30 slots. Those states, again, for the ARC are Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Maryland, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Kentucky. You can also do this within the Delta Regional Commission. The HHS is another organization or government agency that supports waivers. They do this for primary care HIPSA locations, primary care physicians and HIPSAs, but they also support waivers for scientists, physician scientists who are really outstanding in their work, and these are geared for people who may have like an NIH-funded project in which they're the principal investigator, and you really have to make the argument that it is critical that this person be able to remain in the United States to carry out this research, and that it's not, the research will just fall apart if this person had to go home for 2 years. It's also possible to do waivers on your own, not through a government agency, and the two are the hardship waiver and the persecution waiver. The hardship waiver is the more common one of the two. You have to show that if you were to go home, that your U.S. citizen or a permanent resident spouse or child would suffer exceptional hardship. And it's not really a hardship to the J1 physician, but rather to the qualifying relative. And then you also have to show what would happen if you went back home but your family member stayed back in the United States, and how that would be an exceptional hardship, and not just the separation, but there's something that's additionally, a burden to the U.S. citizen or permanent resident anchor relative. The persecution waiver is a higher standard in certain ways than an asylum application. But if you fear persecution based on in your home country, based on race or religion or political opinion, things like that, then you could obtain a waiver. Just keep in mind that all of these waivers, we're just talking about waivers of the 2-year home residence requirement. So after you receive either a waiver based on hardship or an IGA waiver or persecution waiver, if you would like to remain in the United States, you would need to think about the next steps, which are your non-immigrant visa. Do you then transition to an H1, for example, and also what your green card permanent residency plans are, because then you would need to then file a petition for permanent residency. If, for example, this is based on persecution, you can then do an asylum application. If it's based on a CONRAD or an IGA waiver, then those are typically done through labor certification through the employer, where you're already fulfilling your waiver requirement. Okay, that's on the waivers. Now moving on from J1s to H1Bs, the H1B is the most common work visa for a professional in the United States. We are actually in the midst of the H1B season right now. H1Bs are given for a total of 6 years, initially for 3 years and then 6 years total. It is definitely possible to go beyond the 6 years, but this can only happen if you start a green card process well before the 5th year of your 6-year time. Just something to keep in mind, if you're going to be doing some research before you start your residency, and that research is going on based on H1B, you're already using up some of your H1B time, so that if you then transition to the J1 for, let's say, a surgery residency, then just keep in mind that you will need to save at least 3 years at the tail end once you finish, so that you can do your CONRAD waiver or your VA waiver, and you would have those 3 years to finish that, because one of the conditions of having one of these IGA waivers is that once the waiver is granted, you do have to get H-1B status and work in that particular location in valid H-1B status for 3 years in order to fulfill the requirements of the waiver. H-1B is often, the preferred choice for people going into residency because then you can avoid the whole J1 2-year home residence requirement. However, most hospitals prefer not to do an H-1B because they tend to be expensive and the J1s are often just easier. But there is also the 6-year limit, so if you have plans to do significant number of fellowships, then you might be reaching the end of your 6 years in your training. 6 years of H-1B time will be used up in your training. Okay. When to file, you can file up to 6 months before the start date. And so we are actually filing on April 1st for people who are going to be starting their H-1B jobs on October 1st. But if you're going to do your residency or fellowship on an H-1 and you're matching this month, then you can definitely start the H-1B application process now and then request immigration to change your status as of June 15th or July 1, whenever your program is going to start. Okay. The other sort of challenge with the H-1Bs is that there is a limited number of new H-1B visas, numbers that are given every year. It's limited to 65,000. They typically receive more than 100,000 H-1B applications on the first sort of couple of days of the filing window, so which for us is the first week of April, and then because there's so many applications that are received, they will conduct a lottery to randomly select the applications. If you have the basic, a bachelor's degree or advanced degree, but it's not from a U.S. school, then your chances of being selected in this H-1B lottery may be as low as 30 or 40%. If you have an advanced degree from a U.S. university, then there's an additional 20,000 that you can visa numbers set aside so you could go through the lottery twice. First for that 20,000, and then they put you in the pool for the remaining 65,000. There are people who are not subject to this H-1B, so don't worry if you're going to be doing your residency on H-1B, because all teaching hospitals are exempt from this H-1B cap because they're affiliated with medical schools or universities. If you're a J1 physician who's going to be doing a Conrad waiver and you need to be on an H-1B as part of that waiver obligation, then you're also not subject to the H-1B cap. This really becomes important when you're finishing your training and now you're looking at joining a private practice group. Then the timing is critical because you'd want to make sure that the application for your H-1B with your private practice group is filed by April 1, so you can secure one of these H-1B numbers. But the start date's not going to happen until October 1. And if your training is finishing on June 30th, there's going to be a gap of about 3 months. So you may have to go home for 3 months and then come back at the end of September, beginning of October, when your H-1B becomes effective. Another way to possibly go around this is to continue working at the teaching hospital for a few months and then sort of transition back onto the and have a concurrent H-1 with the private practice group. Okay, H-1Bs have to be filed by an employer, so you cannot do this on your own. You absolutely need a job offer. You have to be paid a prevailing wage. For physicians who are going through residency, we can use specific salary surveys for residents, so you're not being compared to already licensed physicians. You do need to have an MD or equivalent. And in addition to your USMLE Steps 1 and 2, you also need Step 3. The medical license is also critical if you're going on to now your attending position and the state requires a medical license. You do need to have that in place when you're doing the H-1B filing. There are certain states that will not issue the medical license until you have the visa in place. It is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but as long as you can get a letter from them saying that you've met all the requirements but for your visa, that should be sufficient to get the immigration to approve the H-1B petition. Sometimes immigration will also limit the validity of the H-1B to the validity of the license. So even though your employer is asking for 3 years, if your license is only valid for a year, they may cut it short to the validity of the license. The H-1B, as you can see, is very expensive. These fees are supposed to be paid by the employer, and the legal fees are also supposed to be paid by the employer. Okay, now the question is, are you going to change your status within the United States, or would you like to go back home and consular process? The process for changing statuses in the United States is filed with USCIS's Service Center. There is either a service center in California for the western region, or in Vermont for the ones who are working in the sort of the eastern side of the United States. Just keep in mind that there cannot be any gaps in status. So if you have entered the United States as a tourist and you're only admitted until, let's say, May, but your program is not going to be starting until June 15th or July 1, you would not be able to request a change of status because there will be a gap from when your current tourist visa status ends and when the H-1B or the J-1 program will begin. You also want to make sure that that you're not misrepresenting. So if you come in as a tourist, you cannot or should not be filing an application for a work authorization visa within a month or 2 months of your entry. There is a presumption that then you had a different intent if you file so quickly. Also, another factor to keep in mind is that if you do come in on a tourist visa and then you proceed to file for a change of status, that's all fine, but you may have a harder time getting a visa in the future, or if you would like to have your spouse join you in the United States, we have heard of the spouse's visas being denied because the principal had applied for a change of status within the United States from specific B visa to like the J or the H visa. The change of status process for an H-1B is where the employer will file the Form I-129 petition with the Service Center. It is possible to request premium processing. Premium processing is an additional filing fee of $1,225, but it also means that immigration will adjudicate your application within two weeks. The regular process is can be about 2 to 3 months. The J-1 change of status is done on Form I-539. This is an application that's submitted by the actual J-1 foreign national visa holder, not by the employer. So once you have the DS 2019 issued either by ECF&G if it's for GME or the university if it's for research, then you can file to change status with this application I-539. It takes about 2 months, and there is no premium processing available. For both of these change of status applications, you do need to wait for the application to be approved by immigration before you can start the program. Okay, then you can also go back home to your home consulate, to the U.S. consulate in your home country and apply for the visa there. It's also possible to apply as a third country national in Canada or Mexico. Okay. Some factors to keep in mind when you are applying for a visa. There are security checks, and this is something that's more often more relevant for folks who are coming from predominantly Muslim countries. They have these various names, but there is like a visa condor and a visa mantis, and so depending on which type of security check it is, it may take anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 or 6 weeks, depending on on exactly what the hit is on that security check. The visa mantis is based on sensitive technology, and this is really becomes more relevant or for people who are from China or India, and they are in particular areas that are considered sensitive technology, and then you may receive a further request from the consulate to make sure that you're not doing any work that's potentially military applications involved, or something that would be of interest to the the Defense Ministry. The donkey is where you have some type of a hit in the system, which could be something like there's a common name or another person who has a name similar to yours, and this can take a very long time to resolve. The NCIC is one where there's an actual hit based on like a criminal offense or matter in your system, and if you do have such an issue on file, then when you go to the consulate, just make sure that you bring all of the documents related to that particular arrest or offense to show that it's not a ground of inadmissibility and it's been resolved, and those go through much more quickly if you do have everything ready to present to the consular officer. Okay, if you do have a security check and it's been more than 90 days, it is possible to do an inquiry. For those who get stuck for several months, where their program has already started and and they've almost lost their spot, it may be worthwhile reaching out to the local congressional office where the hospital is located to see if congressional liaison can help get the matter unstuck or see what the issue is with your particular situation. Another issue to keep in mind, this is for people who are getting an H-1B visa or other petition from immigration. When you file an application with USCIS, we actually submit everything in duplicate because immigration forwards a copy of the petition to the State Department, and it goes into this PIM system. And when you go to the consulate to get your visa, the consular officer is going to access the petition through PIMS to verify what is stated on the petition to make sure it's all consistent with what they're asking you during the interview. And sometimes if you're going for your visa appointment very quickly after your petition is approved, it may not be entered into the PIM system yet, and so it could delay your visa issuance by a few days so that the consular officer can have the State Department upload the petition, and then they can make sure that that this is properly input into the system. Okay, and then if you are denied a visa, certainly you should get a letter from the visa officer, write down exactly what happened. There are two types of denials. One is a 221G denial, and that's often where they need some additional information from you. For example, if you got one of those Manta security check hits, you would just submit the additional documents. A 214B denial, this is more related to, for example, someone applying for a J1 visa or a B1 visa, and that's where the consular officer is just not convinced that you're going to go home. So they may say, you can apply, but next time you make sure you have more documents showing your ties to your home country. And then you can always resubmit your visa application and request a reconsideration. And then if you know that you're going to get a security check because you've had that happen in the past, you can have some documents ready to submit to the consular officer. For example, if you're already in the middle of your residency program and you're going home for a visa renewal, then perhaps have a letter from your program director explaining that if you're absent for several weeks, that it's going to really hurt the program and the patients that the hospital is So something like that would be helpful to present to the consular officer so that they can do what they can to make sure that the security check is resolved more quickly. And then if this whole issue of whether or not to avoid travel, this is really becomes more relevant for folks who are from some of the more predominantly Muslim countries, such as from Pakistan. We have heard of stories of people having their visas revoked when they had gone home because there was a potential match with some other character. So just really, if you are from countries like that, just take some time to think about how important this travel is for you, and whether or not you want to just finish your training, and then once all of that is done, then consider taking that trip back home. Okay, some other risks of issues or risks of travel. Just if you are on a J1, make sure that you have notified the programs such as ECF&G that you're traveling, so they issue you the proper paperwork or DS 2019, and you have that as current when you're traveling. Make sure your visa hasn't expired. Some countries have limited visa reciprocity schedules, so even though your petition may be valid for 3 years, the actual visa stamp may be limited for 1 year or a single entry. So just make sure that your visa is current. Some other issues, if you had any violations, like criminal issues or offenses while you're in the United States, then that will be in the system, so just keep in mind of that. I wouldn't travel if something like that were to have happened. And then there is this issue of people who have common names from certain countries that might run into trouble because there's a match with somebody who's unrelated, but it still can become a nightmare for certain people. Okay, so with that, I've reached the end of my presentation. Just to recap some of the things that we've talked about, and then also if you have any questions, please do type in your questions or feel free to email them to me. My email address is on screen, and I'm happy to answer your questions offline as well. But this is an exciting time for those who are applying for residency, and I wish you all the best for match day. And then once you do find out and you've matched, you do need to move quickly to obtain that H-1B or J-1 visa to make sure that that you can start on time. And then once you're sort of further along in your training, by the time you are sort of in your final year is starting, that's really when you need to think about the next steps. Are you going to apply for a Conrad waiver? If so, you really need to start looking for jobs the summer before you graduate, and have that locked in place by maybe August or September so that the application can be filed as soon as the filing window opens on October 1, and then you're in a good place to have all of that completed on time, and then you can just transition on to the H-1B waiver part of your immigration status. And then after you've completed that, then looking long term, you would have to then start thinking about which company you're going to start your green card process. So it is a long road, but it's certainly doable, and we're happy to answer any questions or guide you along the way. So I will take some questions now. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so I have a question about someone who's on F1 OPT and is applying to medical school. So once you are admitted into medical school, then the school will issue you a new I-20 to transfer your I-20 from your current school and OPT to the graduate school, to the medical school. It is possible to do, after you've completed your medical school, your MD, and you have 1 year of OPT, you can do 1 year of residency on that, but just keep in mind that it may become a challenge to then do residency after that on a J1. You would have to check with ECF&G, but there might be some issues in getting a J1 from a U.S. medical degree. You might have to do your residency on an H1. But that's just something that you should sort of keep in mind down the road, and perhaps pose this question to ECF&G about becoming a U.S. medical graduate applying for residency. And then also, this issue is, is it better to change visas or I'm not sure if this relates to the same question on the F1, but as long as your I-20s are valid, you do then need to, if you're planning to travel, you will need to go get a new F1 visa stamp done as well. But the visa is only important if you're going to be traveling internationally. Otherwise, if you're going to just be here, just make sure that your I-20s are always valid and current. Okay. All right. If there are any further questions, I think we will end the webinar now. But please do feel free to